I had an interesting chat with a student I've got working with me at the moment the other day. We were discussing using hip thrusts as a rehab exercise in the gym, and I'm a big fan of them with lower limb injuries. Sometimes, whether it's surgeon's orders or just the injury stage itself, sometimes you can't squat, which would be my preference, and I found hip thrusts and RDLs a great way to maintain some lower limb strength until you can bring in those squat patterns for whatever the reasons they are. But the discussion we were having was around the technique of a hip thrust, and do you allow any back extension, or do you focus and cue just hip extension to a neutral spine position? And my student was making the point that he cues to the neutral spine position and that he likes to use the hip thrust exercise for athletes he feels struggle to terminally extend their hip during sprinting and have a weakness of their anterior core. And it got me thinking about, in that scenario of sprinting, are those athletes weak in hip extension, or are they just not good at it in that movement? And the longer I've worked in sport, I think it's a really key distinction. I've seen a number of athletes who've been told, oh, you're weak at this, you're weak at that. But when you really break down and test some of those movements or muscle groups, you couldn't say they're weak. And I think, if we define true weakness as low force production, then there can be a difference between low force production and contractile effort from muscle tissue compared to poor motor coordination and timing of that force production. The beauty of team sports, I think, is you see athletes who, by raw numbers in the gym, wouldn't be considered overly above average compared to some general populations, and yet they can do things on a sporting field that make them some of the strongest competitors out there. In rugby league terms, people have long said about someone like Cameron Smith and the accountant's body and whatever, and yet every player I've ever talked to just talks about how when he gets a hold of you can't get away. And then there's plenty of other athletes out there that can lift the house down in the gym but have never had very good football careers. In baseball terms, there's tons of baseball players out there that aren't overly impressive or strong in a gym setting, and yet they can throw 100 miles an hour because whatever strength they do have, they can coordinate and express 100% of that strength and power into that movement. I'm sure there's guys out there that are better than Usain Bolt in the gym, and yet no one can run as fast as him. So it's a key distinction if you're dealing with an injured athlete, and especially if they're having recurrent injuries and you're trying to figure out why. Don't always pin the problem on strength. Sometimes it might be that they just aren't good enough at expressing the strength they have, and so in that case you may need to spend more time practicing the movement that they're trying to do as opposed to just building numbers in the gym. Having said that, I think having good numbers in the gym will give you a bit of wiggle room either side and should have a protective effect. But if they have enough attempts at the movement, in this example sprinting, with bad technique, eventually something's going to break down when you start adding fatigue and decision making and all those kind of other factors. So yeah, it was just an interesting conversation we had, and I think you could go both ways on the argument, but the thing physios are often good at is really assessing and identifying some of those factors, but not necessarily being great at developing them physically, and for S&C coaches, they're trained in developing those physical qualities, but not always as good at identifying which ones actually need to be developed, especially if things continually go wrong. I think you only ever hear about people's failures if things are going right. Then you never know whether you're messing something up. But yeah, it's always worth considering, is someone weak in the force production sense of the word, or are they not so skillful at expressing the force that they are capable of producing? Love to hear thoughts. Hit me up on Instagram or Twitter or anything like that. And otherwise, until next time, thanks.